The afternoon sun bathed the rolling fields in a soft golden haze, turning every blade of grass into a ribbon of light. Caleb Morgan guided his horse toward the northern fence line, a stretch of weathered posts he meant to mend before winter set in. He liked these quiet moments, the rhythmic creak of the saddle, the gentle snort of his horse, and the wind carrying only the sound of cicadas and distant cows. Solitude had become his closest companion ever since life had taught him that silence didn't disappoint. But that peace was interrupted by laughter, light, musical, and startlingly out of place. Caleb frowned and slowed his horse. Laughter didn't belong here. His land was miles from town and few people ever wandered this way. He dismounted quietly and followed the sound. When he reached the fence, the sight that met him stole his breath. Two little girls stood on the other side, balancing on a fallen log like it was a tightrope. Twins no older than 6, identical right down to the flyaway curls that gleamed like spun honey in the sun. One held a wildflower, the other a stick she used to poke at the dust. They were covered in grass stains, their dresses faded and a size too big. Still, their faces were lit with mischief and wonder, the kind that made Caleb's heart ache with something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Hey there," he said gently, resting his arms on the top rail. "You girls lost?" The smaller one, Lily, as he'd later learned, gasped and hid behind her sister. The other, braver one, stared up at him with a mix of awe and curiosity. "You're real," she whispered. Caleb blinked. "Real? Uh-huh," she said solemnly. "Mama said cowboys don't live here anymore. But you got a hat and a horse and everything." Caleb chuckled. "Guess that makes me a rare sight then." Lily peeked out from behind her sister, her big blue eyes shy but hopeful. "Mister, can you be our daddy for today?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He straightened, his smile faltering. "Your daddy?" Emma, he'd find out her name later too, nodded eagerly. "Just for today. We want to see what it's like. Other kids at school have daddies who pick them up, but ours—" She trailed off and looked at the ground, twisting the hem of her dress. Caleb's throat tightened. The air between them grew still, heavy with the kind of innocence that could break a man's heart. He didn't know their story, but he recognized the emptiness behind that question. He'd felt it too, years ago when loss had left him hollow. "Well," he said at last, his voice rough, "I don't know if I'd make a very good one, but I can show you how to feed a horse. Would that count?" Two faces lit up like sunrise. The girls clapped, giggling as Caleb led his horse closer to the fence. They reached through the rails with tiny palms, squealing when the horse's velvety muzzle brushed their fingers. Caleb found himself laughing too, really laughing for the first time in years. He spent the next hour talking with them, showing them how to whistle softly so the horse would come, how to pat its neck without startling it. Every time he looked at them, that tight knot in his chest loosened a little more. As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, Caleb realized something strange. He didn't want the moment to end. "Time to head home, girls," he said softly. "Your mom'll be worried." They pouted but nodded. Before they ran off, Emma looked back and grinned. "Thanks for being our daddy today." Caleb stood there long after they disappeared down the dirt road, staring at the horizon. He didn't know it yet, but that simple encounter, 2 little girls, a fence, and a question spoken from the heart, was about to change his quiet, lonely life forever. That evening, the ranch felt different. The same old walls, the same old creak of the wooden floorboards, but something had shifted in Caleb Morgan's chest. He sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the sunset that bled into the hills. Normally, this time of day brought him a quiet kind of peace, the kind that came from routine and predictability. But tonight his thoughts were tangled with the sound of 2 little girls laughing by his fence. It had been years since laughter had echoed around his ranch. Years since anyone small enough to reach only halfway up his leg had run through the grass calling for him. The emptiness used to be comfortable, a shield against the ache of what he'd lost. Now it felt heavier somehow. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Emma and Lily. Even their names lingered in his head like a song he couldn't stop humming. Their innocence, their bright questions, their fearless smiles. They'd stirred something he thought had gone cold long ago. Inside, the ranch house was spotless but lifeless. A single framed photograph sat on the mantel, a young woman with a wide grin, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Hannah, Caleb's fiancée, the one he'd planned to build a life with before a car accident stole her away 5 years ago. He'd never taken that photo down. He couldn't. It was all he had left of the life he'd almost lived, the one filled with laughter, shared breakfasts, and maybe children of their own. After Hannah's death, Caleb had thrown himself into work, fixing fences, tending cattle, expanding the ranch. It kept his hands busy and his heart numb. The silence became easier than facing what he'd lost, until today. He could still see Emma's small hand reaching through the fence, her giggle when his horse snorted against her palm. He could still hear Lily's shy voice asking if his horse slept inside. For the first time in years, Caleb had found himself answering questions that had nothing to do with chores or feed prices. Questions full of wonder, not work. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled, a sound caught between a sigh and a laugh. "You're getting soft, old man," he muttered to himself. They're just kids, but the truth sat heavier than that. Those 2 little girls had reminded him of the kind of warmth he'd buried with Hannah, the kind that came from caring, from connection, from love. The next morning, he rode out early, telling himself he just wanted to check the northern fence again. But as his horse carried him toward that same stretch of land, he knew it wasn't the fence he was hoping to see. The girls weren't there. The log they'd been balancing on lay empty, a small flower crown abandoned on the grass. Caleb dismounted and picked it up carefully. The petals were crushed but still fragrant, wild daisies and clover woven clumsily with tiny hands. He smiled despite himself and tucked it into his saddlebag. Back at the ranch house, he caught himself glancing toward the road that led to town. He wondered where they lived, what their mother was like, what kind of life those girls went home to. The thought unsettled him, not just because he cared, but because he hadn't cared about anyone in years. That night, Caleb sat by the fireplace, the flower crown resting beside the old photograph of Hannah. The flickering light cast shadows across both, one memory from his past, one from his unexpected present. He whispered softly as though Hannah could hear him. "You'd have liked them. Sweet kids, remind me what kindness looks like." The fire crackled, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt expectant, as if the ranch itself was waiting. Like it knew something Caleb didn't yet. That 2 little girls and their mother were about to bring life back to this quiet, broken place in ways he couldn't imagine. From the window of a small weathered cottage at the edge of town, Grace Turner watched her daughters playing near the fence line, farther than she usually allowed them to go. Her heart fluttered between relief and worry as their laughter carried across the field. Emma's voice was always the loudest, confident and curious, while Lily's was softer, like the breeze rustling through tall grass. Grace had meant to call them back sooner, but the sight before her made her pause. The girls weren't alone. A tall man stood by the fence, broad-shouldered, with sunburned skin and a worn hat shading his eyes. His horse stood beside him, muscles glinting under the sunlight. Grace's first instinct was fear. Out here, strangers were rare, and a man that size could mean trouble. She took a hesitant step forward, her fingers tightening around the edge of the window frame. But then she saw how gently the man spoke to her girls, how patient he was when Emma tugged at his sleeve, how careful he moved when Lily, shy as a fawn, reached out to pet his horse. Something in the way he crouched down to their level. How he smiled. Not out of pity, but genuine warmth, stilled her breath. Grace hadn't seen a man look at her daughters like that in a long time. Not since Daniel, her late husband. The memory came back in waves. Daniel's easy laugh, the smell of engine oil from his workshop, the way he used to lift both girls into his arms like they were feathers. But that warmth had vanished 2 years ago in a stormy night of screeching tires and flashing lights. Grace had woken to sirens and silence. Since then, she had learned to survive alone. Mornings started before dawn, packing lunches, ironing uniforms, cleaning houses across town to keep food on the table. Her hands were always tired, her back sore, but she didn't complain. She couldn't afford to. She'd built her world around making sure her daughters never saw how scared she really was. Yet now, as she stood there watching that stranger, watching Caleb Morgan, though she didn't know his name yet, something in her chest twisted painfully. The girls were laughing, carefree in a way they hadn't been for months. Grace stepped outside quietly, meaning to call them home. But halfway across the yard, she froze. "Please, mister," Emma said, her small voice carrying clearly in the still air. Just be our daddy for today." Grace's heart stopped. She pressed a hand to her chest, swallowing hard. The words hit her like a slap and a plea all at once. She wanted to shout, to tell her daughters to stop, to explain that you couldn't just ask strangers to fill empty spaces like that. But she couldn't move. The rancher didn't laugh. He didn't look uncomfortable or turn away. Instead, he crouched down, his voice calm, gentle. "I don't know if I'd make a good one," he said, "but I can show you how to feed a horse." Grace's throat tightened. Tears stung her eyes. She turned back toward the house before the girls could see her crying. Inside, she leaned against the counter, her breath trembling. Her daughters missed their father every single day, and she had tried so hard to be both mom and dad, to be enough. But no matter how many bedtime stories she told, no matter how many scraped knees she kissed, there was a space in their hearts that she couldn't fill. And now, by some strange twist of fate, a stranger in a cowboy hat had stepped into that space, if only for an afternoon. Grace didn't know who he was or why his kindness felt so disarming. But as she wiped her eyes and looked out again, watching him lift Lily onto his horse with gentle hands, she knew one thing for certain: her careful, guarded world had just shifted, and she wasn't ready for what that meant. The sun dipped low over the hills by the time Caleb Morgan walked the twins home. The trail wound past the fence line, through wildflower patches and the edge of the creek where frogs croaked in the reeds. Emma skipped ahead, swinging his calloused hand as if they'd known each other for years. Lily, quieter, clutched a dandelion and blew its seeds into the evening breeze. Caleb couldn't help but smile. For all the silence that filled his days, this chatter, innocent and unfiltered, felt like music. "Do you live all by yourself, Mr. Caleb?" Emma asked. He nodded, tipping his hat back. "Just me and the horses." "That sounds lonely," she said matter-of-factly. He chuckled softly. "Sometimes it is." By the time they reached the cottage, the sun had melted into gold and amber light. The little house stood weathered but tidy, flower pots on the porch, curtains mended with care. As they climbed the steps, the door opened and Grace Turner appeared. Caleb had prepared himself for a scolding. Any mother would panic seeing her children walk home with a stranger. But the look on Grace's face wasn't anger. It was a mix of shock, relief, and something deeper he couldn't quite name. "Emma. Lily." Her voice was firm, though it trembled at the edges. "Where have you been?" "By the ranch," Emma chirped proudly. "We met a cowboy." Grace's eyes flicked to Caleb, assessing him quickly. Her first thought was that he looked exactly like someone out of a dream her daughters might invent. Tall, rugged, hands rough from work, but eyes kind and steady. He tipped his hat politely. "Ma'am, I'm sorry if I gave you a scare. I found these two at my fence line. Figured I'd walk 'em home before dark." Grace folded her arms, trying to steady herself. "They shouldn't have been bothering you." "Not a bother," he said simply. "Best company I've had all week." That disarmed her more than she wanted to admit. His voice was low and warm, with a faint rasp that hinted at long days in the sun and longer nights spent alone. Grace's instincts told her to thank him and close the door quickly, but her daughters were already tugging on his sleeve, begging him to stay for supper. Caleb smiled but shook his head. "That's kind, but I've got chores to finish before dark." He started to step off the porch, then paused, noticing the broken boards near the railing. "Your fence looks like it's seen better days. I could fix it up tomorrow if you'd like." Grace blinked. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said with a faint smile. "But I want to." There was no trace of pity in his tone, just quiet sincerity. Grace hesitated, torn between pride and gratitude. She'd spent so long carrying everything alone that accepting help felt dangerous. But when Lily yawned and leaned against her leg, she sighed. "All right. Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Caleb," he corrected gently. "No Mr. needed." As he tipped his hat and walked away, Grace watched him until the dust from his boots settled back to earth. The twins were still buzzing with excitement, telling her how Caleb's horse had nuzzled their hands and how he'd promised to teach them to whistle for it next time. Grace listened, smiling faintly, though her thoughts were elsewhere. It had been a long time since a man offered help without expecting something in return. A long time since kindness came without strings. She didn't know what to make of it, or of the way her heart had stuttered when he'd looked at her with those steady, unguarded eyes. Later, after she tucked the twins into bed, Grace stepped onto the porch and looked toward the distant ranch. Somewhere out there, she knew he was probably fixing a gate or feeding his horses under the same rising moon. "Thank you, Cowboy," she whispered into the quiet night. She didn't expect he'd hear it, but somehow. Caleb looked up at the stars just then and smiled as if he had. The next morning dawned bright and cool, the kind of morning where the sky seemed too blue and the air too clean for heavy thoughts. Grace Turner stood at her kitchen window, tying her hair back as she watched her daughters chase each other through the yard. Their laughter lifted through the open window, and beyond the fence she could see him, Caleb Morgan. True to his word, he'd come back early with his tool belt slung around his hip and a bundle of new fence posts in the bed of his truck. He moved with an easy, quiet rhythm, focused, patient, his muscles flexing under a plain white shirt as he worked. Grace tried not to notice, tried and failed. "Is Mr. Cowboy fixing the fence for us, Mama?" Emma called, her voice high and sweet. Grace smiled faintly. "Looks like it. Can we help?" "Not today, honey. Let the man work." But Caleb didn't seem to mind the help. When he spotted the twins watching from the porch, he waved them over. Before Grace could object, they'd already run to him, barefoot and grinning. Within minutes, Lily was holding nails in her tiny palms, while Emma asked endless questions about tools, horses, and whether Cowboy still slept under the stars. Grace stood there helplessly, her heart tugging between anxiety and warmth. He was a stranger, technically, but he didn't feel like one. Not when he crouched to show the girls how to hold a hammer safely, or when he laughed, a deep sound that filled the open air. Around noon, Grace brought out lemonade and biscuits, telling herself it was only polite. Caleb wiped his hands on a rag and thanked her softly, the corner of his mouth lifting in that quiet, grateful way that disarmed her every time. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Neither did you," she replied before she could stop herself. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, something cautious, fragile, and real. For the next few weeks, Caleb became a constant presence. He fixed the fence, then the loose porch step, then the stubborn kitchen window that hadn't opened right in years. Each time he came by, Grace told herself it would be the last. Each time she found herself waiting by the window, hoping she was wrong. The girls adored him. He took them riding on gentle horses, taught them to skip rocks, and built them a swing from an old rope and a sturdy oak branch. The sound of their laughter filled the ranch again, his ranch and hers, as if the space between them was shrinking one visit at a time. But beneath the warmth, Grace battled a quiet fear. She had promised herself never to depend on anyone again, never to let her heart soften toward a man who might leave. Still, every time Caleb smiled at her daughters, every time his gaze lingered a second too long on her face, she felt her resolve weakening. One evening after supper, Caleb stayed to help fix the chicken coop door. The twins had already fallen, asleep inside, and the yard glowed under the amber spill of the porch light. Grace handed him a screwdriver, their fingers brushing lightly. It shouldn't have meant anything, but the spark that shot through her skin said otherwise. "You don't have to keep helping," she murmured, not meeting his eyes. "I know," he said quietly, "but I like being here." The honesty in his voice undid her. She wanted to believe him, to believe this gentle rhythm they were building wasn't temporary. But deep down, a small voice warned her that peace like this never lasted. After he left that night, Grace stood on the porch for a long while, arms wrapped around herself as the crickets sang. The air smelled like hay and summer rain, and though she didn't want to admit it, she missed him already. Across the field, Caleb walked home under the starlight, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. He'd never meant to get attached, but the truth was simple and impossible to ignore. He wasn't just fixing her fence anymore. He was falling for the woman who stood behind it. The weeks that followed felt almost like a dream, a quiet, unexpected rhythm of shared moments and small kindnesses. Grace Turner began to smile more easily. The girls laughed louder. Even Caleb Morgan found himself whistling again while he worked. But dreams, Grace knew, never lasted long. It started with a letter. A stiff white envelope stamped with a lawyer's seal, addressed to Grace Turner, personal and confidential. She found it wedged in her mailbox one windy afternoon. Her stomach tightened the moment she saw the name printed at the top. Evelyn Turner, her late husband's mother. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The words blurred as she read, "Petition for custody review. Concerns of financial instability. Request for evaluation of the children's living conditions." By the time she reached the end, Grace's vision had gone cloudy with tears. Evelyn had always been polite in public, helpful, as people in town called her, but beneath the surface she'd never believed Grace was capable of raising 2 children alone, and now she was trying to take them. Grace folded the letter and sank onto the porch steps, shaking. All she'd done for the past 2 years was fight, to keep food on the table, to stay strong for her girls, and now it felt like everything could be ripped away. When Caleb rode by that evening to deliver a basket of apples, he saw the tear tracks on her cheeks before she could hide them. "Grace?" he said softly, stepping closer. "What happened?" She hesitated, clutching the letter like it might burn her. "It's nothing, just legal nonsense." He crouched in front of her, his brow furrowed. "That doesn't look like nothing." She sighed shakily. "It's from Daniel's mother. She thinks I'm not providing a stable home. She's trying to get custody of the girls." Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. "That's not right. You're a good mother. Anyone can see that." "I'm barely holding things together," Grace whispered. "She's right about that part. The bills, the repairs, the everything. I can't lose them, Caleb. They're all I have." Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. "You won't lose them." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the promise in his eyes, steady and certain. But the comfort only deepened her fear, because leaning on him felt too easy, too dangerous. Later that night after he left, Grace sat by her daughters' beds, brushing their hair from their foreheads as they slept. Emma murmured something in her dreams, Caleb's name, followed by giggles. Grace's throat tightened. She couldn't let her girls get too attached, not when their lives might be uprooted again. Meanwhile, at the ranch, Caleb couldn't sleep. Grace's pain lingered with him like a ghost. He stared into the dying embers of the fire, remembering the first time he'd lost someone he loved, how helpless it had felt. He hated seeing that same helplessness in Grace's eyes. The next morning he went to the county courthouse and made quiet inquiries, what kind of support Grace might need, what her legal rights were. The clerk told him it would take time and money, both things Grace barely had. Caleb's jaw clenched. Money he could provide, time he could give. But when he showed up at her porch later that week with the papers and an idea to help, Grace's reaction wasn't what he expected. "You went to the courthouse?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Without telling me?" "I just wanted to help." "You can't fix this, Caleb," she snapped. "You can't fix everything." The silence that followed was thick and painful. The twins watched from the doorway, wide-eyed. Grace's shoulders sagged as she realized how harsh her tone had been. "Caleb, He shook his head gently. "It's all right." His voice was quiet, but there was a hurt behind it. "I just wanted to make things easier for you." "I know," she whispered. "That's what scares me." He gave her a small, sad smile and turned back toward his truck. As he drove away, Grace pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from calling him back. She wanted to, but the fear was stronger, because she'd loved and lost once before, and she didn't think she could survive it again. The storm had come and gone, but it left the world soaked and still, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and cedar. Grace Turner stood in the doorway of Caleb's barn, her heart heavy but strangely calm. Inside, 2 small girls slept soundly beneath a blanket of hay and quilts, her daughters finally safe again. Just hours earlier, panic had clawed at her chest when she realized Emma and Lily were gone. She'd run through the fields in the pouring rain, calling their names until her voice cracked. Then Caleb had found her just like he always did, steady, silent and unshakable. Now, as dawn broke across the hills, Grace sat beside him in the quiet barn, exhaustion and emotion blending into a fragile stillness. The horses rustled softly in their stalls, and the sound of rain dripping from the roof filled the silence between them. Caleb looked over at her, his voice low. "They were just scared," he said gently. "Didn't want to lose you." Grace nodded, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face. "They've lost so much already. Their daddy, our home, every bit of stability we had. They deserve better than this mess." Caleb's gaze softened. "They deserve love. And they've got that. You've done more than most could, Grace." She shook her head, her throat tight. "I'm trying, but it feels like I'm always failing. Like I can't keep up with everything." "The court, my job, the girls?" She hesitated, then met his eyes. "You make it look so easy, being steady, strong." Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It's not easy. I just got used to living with silence. Then 2 little girls showed up by my fence asking me to be their daddy, and I realized I didn't want quiet anymore." Grace's breath caught. His words weren't polished or grand, but they carried a kind of truth that hit straight to her heart. "I wasn't planning on feeling anything again," he continued, voice rough. "But watching you fight for those girls, Grace, it reminded me what it's like to care about someone who's worth fighting for." She looked away, afraid he'd see the tears she couldn't hold back. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "I come with too much baggage." He gave a small, sad smile. "So do I. Maybe we can carry some of it together." Something inside her cracked open then. Not in pain, but in surrender. She'd been fighting for so long against loss, against fear, against her own longing. But as the morning light spilled across the floor, catching on Caleb's tired, kind eyes, she realized she was tired of fighting love too. Grace glanced toward her sleeping daughters, then back at him. "You really think someone like me deserves another chance?" Caleb's reply was quiet, sure. "I don't just think it, Grace, I know it. And I'd be proud to be part of it." Her heart thudded, unsteady but alive. She reached for his hand without thinking, her fingers trembling as they brushed his. He didn't move closer or pull her in. He just stayed there, solid and real, letting her decide. Finally, she whispered, "Then stay." His hand closed around hers, warm and sure. "I will." Outside, the last of the rain faded, leaving the air bright and clean. The storm had passed, not just in the sky, but inside her. Grace leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder, her heart steady for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring new battles, court hearings, worries, and challenges. But for tonight, she had peace. She'd chosen to trust again, and that, she realized, was its own kind of freedom. The late summer sun shone over the wide Texas fields, turning everything gold, the grass, the dust, even the air itself. The storm that had once threatened their lives and hearts had long passed, leaving behind a peace that still felt new and almost fragile. It had been 3 months since that night, the night Caleb Morgan and Grace Turner found the twins huddled together in the barn, crying and terrified they'd be taken away. 3 months since Grace had finally stopped running from her fears and reached for the man who'd already reached for her in every way that mattered. Now, laughter drifted across the ranch again. Emma and Lily were in the pasture, their small hands clutching the reins of a patient brown mare while Caleb guided them, steady and sure. "Easy now," he said, smiling. "Let her feel you leading. Horses listen better to calm hearts." Emma beamed. "Like yours, Mr. Caleb?" He chuckled. "Guess so. Though I think yours are calmer than mine most days." Grace watched from the porch, sunlight brushing her hair with gold. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her daughters so free, so full of life. For the first time in years, they laughed without a shadow behind it. And for the first time in a long, long while, she let herself breathe easy. She still remembered how hard it had been at first, facing Evelyn's custody battle, the endless court dates, the scrutiny over every detail of her life. But this time she hadn't faced it alone. Caleb had stood beside her every step of the way. Quietly, steadfastly, without ever trying to take control. He'd spoken up for her in court, testified about the safe home she'd built, even offered to help her expand her small cleaning business into something stable and lasting. His presence didn't overshadow her. It strengthened her. And when the judge finally ruled in her favor, Grace had cried, not just in relief, but because she realized something deeper. She wasn't just fighting to keep her family. She was finding the courage to let someone else be part of it. Now, That man was part of every morning, every meal, every laugh echoing through the house. Caleb turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers across the yard. There was warmth there, steady, grounding, the kind of love that didn't need words. Grace smiled back, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. When the twins finished their lesson, they ran toward her, breathless and flushed with joy. Emma climbed into her lap while Lily tugged at Caleb's sleeve. "Mr. Caleb?" she asked, her voice small but certain. "Can you be our daddy?" Forever this time. For a heartbeat, the world went still. Grace froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Caleb, half terrified, half hopeful. Caleb knelt down, meeting the girl's wide blue eyes. "You sure about that?" he asked softly. "That's a big job," Lily nodded seriously. "You already do all the daddy things. You fix stuff and you make pancakes and you hug Mama when she cries." A laugh trembled out of Grace, half sob, half joy. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she watched Caleb pull the girls into his arms, his voice rough with emotion. "Well then," he whispered, "I reckon I'd be the luckiest man alive." The twins squealed, hugging him tight. Grace knelt beside them, brushing a tear from her cheek as Caleb's hand found hers. Their fingers intertwined, solid, sure, and full of promise. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the four of them walked together toward the pasture. The sky blazed with color, gold melting into rose, fading into twilight. Emma ran ahead, Lily chasing close behind while Caleb slipped his arm around Grace's shoulders. "You ever think life could look like this again?" he asked quietly. Grace leaned into him, smiling through her tears. "No," she said, "but I think it's exactly what I was meant to find." And as the stars blinked to life over the endless Texas sky, their laughter carried through the open air, steady, bright and whole. For the first time in years, the ranch wasn't just land or work or memory, it was home.